The demonstration was scheduled for 2 o'clock. By 1:50, the Crane Automotive showroom had the specific tension of a room where too much money was present, and not enough of it was comfortable. 43 investors, 11 board members, 9 journalists, and a camera crew from a motorsport publication had arranged themselves around a raised display platform where the Crane Veyron prototype sat under track lighting designed to show it to maximum advantage. The car was the color of dark gunmetal, low and wide, its body lines suggesting speed even at rest. The torque figures on the specification card exceeded anything in Crane's current production line by 40%. Isabel Crane stood at the front of the room in a structured blazer the color of slate, microphone in hand, walking the room through the architecture of what she was calling the company's most important engineering milestone in a decade. She was a capable speaker. She had built Crane Automotive's public profile across 4 years of careful positioning, and she understood how to hold a room, when to pause, when to let silence work, when to let the car speak for itself. She had done this presentation twice in smaller settings. Today was the live version, the one with the cameras, the one that would be cut into promotional material and investor communications for the next 18 months. The prototype's engine started on cue. The sound it made was precisely what a $3 million engine should sound like: controlled, powerful, with a harmonic undertone that registered more in the chest than the ears. The telemetry board to the left of the display stage showed real-time performance data, and the numbers were correct. For 90 seconds, everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. Then the engine faltered. Not catastrophically, it wasn't a bang or a seizure. It was a hesitation, a rough cycling between rev states, the kind of behavior that is immediately recognizable to anyone who works with high-performance engines and immediately alarming to anyone presenting one to 43 investors. The telemetry board showed pressure fluctuations in the rear chamber. The engine recovered briefly, then dropped into a rough idle, and the sound that had filled the room changed quality, from controlled power to mechanical uncertainty. Isabel continued speaking for 4 seconds after the falter. Then she stopped. The room did what rooms do in that moment. It went very still, and the stillness had the particular quality of people deciding whether what they had just witnessed was part of the show. It was not part of the show. The Crane engineering team, 3 senior engineers who had been positioned near the telemetry board, moved to their stations. Tablets came out. There was a brief exchange in low voices. One of them typed something, looked at the result, and his expression did not improve. Ethan Ward had been in the room since 1:30. He was there in his technical maintenance capacity. His current role was night shift lead mechanic, which put him in charge of the prototype bay between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. He had no seat at the demonstration, no credential for the press area, no reason, officially, to be in the investor section. He was near the back of the room, near the service access door, where maintenance personnel positioned themselves at events like this, present in case they were needed, invisible in case they were not. He watched the telemetry for approximately 10 seconds. Then he moved toward the car. He had taken perhaps 4 steps when Isabel's voice found him. "Don't touch that car." She said it with the microphone still live. The room heard it. The cameras recorded it. The 43 investors and 11 board members and 9 journalists all oriented toward the exchange, which had the sudden, clarifying quality of a moment that will be described later at dinner tables and in conference calls. Ethan stopped. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at Isabel with the specific expression of a man who has heard something he expected and is not surprised by it. "I've worked this engine platform," he said. Quietly, without heat. "The engineering team is handling it." She said this to the room as much as to him, the recovery statement, the reassertion of order. "Please step back." He stepped back. He stood near the service door with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the senior engineers consult their tablets, and there was nothing in his posture that communicated defeat or anger. He simply watched the way a person watches something they understand, with patience, waiting for the conversation to catch up with the diagnosis. The engine continued its rough idle. The telemetry numbers did not improve. Isabel did not look at him again. The drive home took 22 minutes. Ethan drove it in a kind of silence that wasn't empty, the silence of a mind continuing to work through something without needing to narrate it. He had the heat on low. The radio was off. Outside, the city moved past in its evening configuration, lights coming on in apartments, delivery vehicles double parked, a group of teenagers at a corner doing what teenagers do at corners. He drove through all of it with the automatic competence of someone whose attention was elsewhere. He parked in front of the house at 6:58 and sat in the car for 2 minutes before going in. The house was small and sufficiently lit, the way houses become when a single parent has learned to manage the transition from work to home as a deliberate act rather than a passive one. The lights in the kitchen were on. He could hear a cartoon through the front door. He came in, hung his jacket on the hook that was his hook, set his keys in the bowl that was the keys bowl. These were the small rituals that separated outside from inside, that gave an arrival its shape. Lily was at the kitchen table with a drawing she had been working on for the past 40 minutes, based on the spread of colored pencils across the surface. She was 7, and she had her mother's intensity when she was making something, a quality of focused presence that shut out everything peripheral and gave whatever she was doing the full weight of her attention. She looked up when he came in. "You look tired," she said. "I'm all right. You look like you looked that time the furnace broke." He looked at her. She was already back on the drawing. "What are you making?" "A car." She didn't look up. "One that doesn't break." He filled a glass of water at the tap and stood with it for a moment, looking at her drawing from across the kitchen. It was a car in the sense that a 7-year-old's rendering of a car carries the essential logic of a car: 4 wheels, body, something at the front that was either an engine or a face. She had not decided. It had flames coming from the back, which he noted without comment. He sat down across from her and put his elbows on the table. "Lily," he said. She finished a line before she looked up. "Machines fail when something that was keeping them in balance gets taken out," he said. "Not because the parts break. Because something that was supposed to be there isn't anymore." She thought about this with the same focused attention she gave the drawing. "Like when you took the wobbly leg off the chair and it fell over?" "Exactly like that. Why do people take the balance out?" "Because balance is harder to see than speed," he said. "People see the speed. They don't always see what's holding it together." She went back to the drawing. She added something to the front. He couldn't see what from his angle. "Did that happen today?" she asked. Not looking up. He looked at the glass in his hands. "Yeah," he said. "That happened today." She nodded, the small nod of a child who has received an answer that fits with what she already suspected. "Did you fix it?" she asked. "Not yet. But you know how." It wasn't a question. She said it the way she said most things she was certain of, flat, declarative, the tone of someone who has gathered the evidence and reached the conclusion and does not require confirmation. "Yeah," he said. "I know how." She finished the drawing with a final line, set down the pencil with the satisfied sound of a completed task, and looked at it with her head slightly tilted. "When you fix it," she said. "Can I see?" "Not at the shop," he said. "But I'll tell you about it." She seemed to accept this as the appropriate terms. She began sorting her pencils back into the tin by color, which was the method she had decided on herself, and which she executed with a precision that he found, as he usually did, quietly extraordinary. He made dinner. He knew exactly what had caused the failure. He had known it from the moment the telemetry numbers appeared on the board, not from the numbers themselves, but from the particular pattern of them, the specific signature of a pressure differential in the rear chamber that matched a known behavior he had once spent 4 months correcting by hand. He had corrected it by designing the torque balancing channel that was supposed to be in the engine. The channel that wasn't there anymore. He knew this the way you know the sound of your own house at night, not through analysis, but through the accumulated familiarity of having built something and lived with its logic for a long time. He made pasta. He made a salad. He asked about school. Lily told him about a project on clouds. He listened, as he always did, completely. 10 years earlier, Ethan Ward had an access badge that opened every door in the building. Not metaphorically, there was a physical badge, blue laminate with his name and a photo from his mid-30s, that unlocked every secured lab, every prototype bay, every engineering archive at Crane Automotive. It had been issued when he took the senior systems role, which put him at the head of the team responsible for powertrain architecture on what would eventually become the company's flagship performance platform. It was a role that required him to understand not just the individual systems he was designing but the way they communicated with each other under load, which is a different kind of understanding and a rarer one. He had come to Crane at 32 from a motorsport engineering background, 2 years designing torque delivery systems for a Formula Regional team, 3 years before that doing powertrain analysis for a mid-size automotive manufacturer. He was not the most credentialed person in the room at Crane, but he was consistently the person who understood what the numbers were saying when the numbers weren't saying anything obvious. The torque balancing geometry he developed in his 3rd year at Crane was the kind of work that doesn't photograph well. It was a pressure channel configuration, a specific routing of the airflow and torque distribution architecture through the rear chamber of the engine, designed to maintain balanced load across both banks of cylinders under sustained high RPM operation. The problem it solved was not dramatic. Without it, the engine ran fine at moderate loads. At full sustained load, over time, it developed a pressure asymmetry that produced rear chamber distortion. Not immediately. Not visibly. But progressively, over thousands of cycles, in a way that shortened the engine's life and compromised its performance envelope at exactly the conditions where a high-performance engine needed to perform. The solution he designed was elegant in the way that good engineering solutions are elegant. It solved the problem through geometry rather than additional components, which meant it added almost no weight and almost no complexity. It worked because it understood the system it was part of. He was still refining it when his wife, Nora, was diagnosed. The diagnosis was a Tuesday, which he remembered with the specific precision of dates that divide time into before and after. He was in the middle of a pressure calibration session, and he got a call from her doctor's office, and he drove to meet her at the hospital, and the world restructured itself around the new information in the way that it does, without asking permission, without offering a timeline. Nora died 2 years and 4 months later. Lily was 3. He had been present for most of those 2 years and 4 months in a way that required him to be absent from the other things his life had contained, the later stage engineering reviews, the patent applications, the performance benchmark sessions, the corporate strategy meetings that were beginning to include his name in the discussions about who would lead the powertrain division next. He had not fought for any of that. The year after Nora died, he had asked for the maintenance lead role. Not a demotion technically, it was a lateral reclassification that allowed him to work nights, which let him be home for school drop-off. He was at home, making Lily's lunch for the following day and listening to her describe the cloud project in more detail than strictly necessary, and he received the results as a forwarded email from the engineering team's shared inbox, which included him as a legacy recipient because no one had ever removed him from the distribution list. A bureaucratic oversight that had ceased being irrelevant approximately 4 hours ago. He read the results at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed. The senior engineers had been thorough. They had run a full thermal analysis, a pressure cycle reconstruction, and an airflow mapping of the rear chamber. Their summary identified 3 primary findings: sustained thermal overload in the rear right cylinder bank, progressive pressure asymmetry between the 2 cylinder banks beginning at approximately 80% load, and evidence of microfracturing in the rear chamber wall consistent with repeated thermal stress cycles. Their conclusion: the prototype required component replacement in the rear cylinder assembly, potentially including the rear chamber wall itself. Estimated repair timeline with parts on order, 3 to 4 weeks. Estimated cost, significant. The recommendation was to suspend the demonstration program pending full assessment, and consider delaying the investor timeline. Ethan read the summary twice. Then he looked at the specific numbers in the thermal analysis, not the conclusions, the underlying data. The pressure differential readings. The temperature gradient between the 2 cylinder banks over the course of the demonstration. The timing of the asymmetry's onset relative to the load increase. It matched. Precisely and completely, it matched the behavioral signature he had documented in pre-production testing 8 years ago, before he introduced the torque balancing channel. The pattern was the same. Not similar, identical, within the measurement tolerance of different diagnostic equipment. The flaw wasn't mechanical. The components themselves were fine. The rear cylinder wall was showing stress because the load wasn't being distributed correctly across the system, and the load wasn't being distributed correctly because the architecture that had been designed to distribute it had been removed. It was an architectural error. The engineers were proposing to treat the symptom, the stressed components, without identifying the cause, which was the absence of the system designed to prevent the stress in the first place. He closed the email. He sat at the table for several minutes. The path forward was clear to him in the way that paths forward are clear when you understand the underlying system, reintroduce the torque balancing channel, recalibrate the pressure distribution, correct the ignition timing curves that had been adjusted to compensate for the removed geometry. The work was precise. It required access to the prototype, access to the original schematics, and the kind of familiarity with the system that came from having designed it. It was not fast work, but it was knowable work, which was a different and more important thing. He sent an email at 10:42 to the engineering team's overnight supervisor, copying the maintenance coordination inbox. He requested access to the prototype bay before the morning assessment, citing the need to complete a maintenance baseline inspection before any component removal began. The request was routine in language. The reason it was routine in language was that he had not yet decided how much to say, and routine language was a door that could be opened or not depending on what was on the other side. The overnight supervisor replied at 11:09, access approved, Bay 3, key code unchanged. Ethan got his jacket. He took the folder from the second drawer of the filing cabinet in his home office. He checked that Lily's monitor was on. She still had it in her room, a habit from her earlier years that he had never felt compelled to remove, and stood in her doorway for a moment, listening to the specific quality of her sleeping breath, which was the same now as it had been when she was 2. Then he went back to the shop. He arrived at the prototype bay at 11:49. The building was on its overnight configuration: low lighting in the corridors, full lighting where motion sensors triggered it, the particular quiet of a facility designed for noise that is now holding silence. The prototype sat in Bay 3 where it had been moved after the demonstration, its hood open, diagnostic equipment still attached from the senior engineer's afternoon session. The telemetry board had been left running, which was either an oversight or deliberate, and which Ethan noted without judgment. He put his jacket on the tool cart. He set the folder on the workbench and opened it. The original schematics were printed on large format sheets, the kind that don't fit in standard folders, and had been trifolded and stored with the care of documents that were not for display but for use. He had reviewed them that morning, before the demonstration, for reasons he had not articulated to himself. Not premonition. More like the way experienced practitioners return to foundational documents before a significant event, not expecting the documents to be needed, but acknowledging that the knowledge they contained had not become less relevant with time. He reviewed them now against the current engine configuration, working through the rear chamber assembly with a systematic attention that moved from the general to the specific in the order he had always used: architecture first, geometry second, tolerances third. He was not in a hurry. He was in the particular state of focused engagement that productive engineering work produces, a state in which time moves differently because the attention has a clear object and the object is yielding to examination. He confirmed what he had already known from the diagnostic data: the torque balancing channel was absent. The rear chamber had been reconfigured without it, using a simplified pressure routing that reduced build complexity at the cost of the load distribution the channel had provided. He identified the modification points. 4 primary, 2 secondary. The primary modifications had been made to accommodate the simplified configuration. Reversing them would restore the original geometry. The secondary modifications were compensatory adjustments, timing curves and airflow sequencing that had been altered to manage the behavior of the simplified system. These would need recalibration once the primary geometry was restored. He began at the primary modification closest to the rear cylinder bank. The work required precision tools and good hands, and he had both. He worked in the same silence he always worked in, not performing quiet, simply not requiring noise as a companion to concentration. The tools made their specific sounds, the controlled torque of a fastener meeting specification, the soft sound of a component seating correctly, the brief metallic note of a fitting accepting the connection it was designed for. These were informational sounds. He was listening to them. At 12:48, the 4 primary modifications were reversed. He inspected each one against the schematic, not because he doubted the work but because inspection was the step after completion, and skipping it would have been a different kind of work than the work he was doing. He moved to the airflow sequencing. The compensation adjustments here were more complex. They had been layered over the simplified configuration across what appeared to be several revision cycles, which meant undoing them required working backward through the logic rather than simply reversing a single change. He did this carefully, cross-referencing the original airflow specifications against the current configuration, identifying the compensatory layers, removing them in reverse order. At 1:51, he began the ignition timing recalibration. The timing curves had been the last adjustment, the final compensation for a system that was being asked to perform without its foundational geometry. Restoring the correct curves meant removing the compensations and returning to the timing architecture the original design had specified. He made the first ignition attempt at 2:09. The engine turned over and stalled. He sat with this for a moment. Not concerned, a first attempt stall after a significant architecture restoration was within expected parameters. It indicated the system was processing the new configuration rather than holding the old one, which was correct. He identified the most likely cause, made a single adjustment to the intake sequencing, and attempted again. The engine caught at 2:16 a.m. For the first 4 seconds it ran rough, the system calibrating, finding the balance points the original geometry was designed to provide. He watched the telemetry. The pressure numbers moved. The thermal readings stabilized. The torque distribution across the 2 cylinder banks began to equalize. By 2:19, the engine was running in a state that matched the original design specification. Load confirm at not approximately. Precisely. He let it run for 11 minutes at sustained load, watching the numbers, watching the thermal distribution settle into the behavior he had predicted when he designed it. There was no drama in this. There was only confirmation, the specific, quiet confirmation of a system doing what it was designed to do. He shut it down at 2:31, ran a full diagnostic capture, and saved it to the engineering system under his maintenance ID. He cleaned his tools. He folded the schematics, and put them back in the folder. He turned off the bay lights and closed the door. The drive home took 22 minutes. The engineering team arrived at 7:15. They came expecting a different morning than the one they got. The expectation had been set the previous evening by the diagnostic results and by everything that follows from diagnostic results of that kind, the conversations about parts, the calls to suppliers, the timeline recalibration, the careful language being prepared for the investors who had witnessed a prototype stall in front of cameras. They arrived with the subdued energy of people who have accepted that the day ahead is going to be difficult and are organizing themselves to manage it. What they found, when they opened Bay 3 and connected the diagnostics, was an engine running. Not idling, not in the fragile, compensatory idle of the previous afternoon, but running in the clean, even way that a correctly configured system runs when its architecture is intact. The thermal readings were nominal. The pressure distribution across the cylinder banks was balanced. The torque output was not merely restored to the pre-failure baseline, it was exceeding it, producing figures that aligned with the original design projection rather than the modified version that had been in production. The telemetry board showed the overnight diagnostic capture, 2:16 a.m. ignition, sustained Dion at 2:19, 11-minute full load run, clean shutdown at 2:31. All of it logged under Ethan Ward's maintenance ID. 3 engineers stood in front of the board without speaking for a moment that was longer than it appeared from outside. The engineering vice president, A composed man named Reyes, who had been with the firm for 14 years, arrived at 7:40 and reviewed the diagnostic data without expression. He asked 2 questions: what specifically had been modified, and where was the documentation for the original configuration. The junior engineer who had been assigned to pull the records, a careful, methodical woman named Dr. Priya Suresh, who would later become significant in the governance restructuring, came back 20 minutes later with 2 items. The first was the diagnostic file from the overnight session, which showed precisely which components had been accessed and in what sequence. The second was a file from the engineering archive that she had located by cross-referencing the modification points. The archive file contained the original torque balancing design documentation, including the schematic that matched the restored configuration. The design was credited to Ethan Ward. The date on the original submission was 9 years ago. Beneath it, in the archive's revision history, was the simplification order, the document that had authorized the removal of the torque balancing channel. It bore 2 signatures. The engineering vice president at the time of the change, who had since left the company. And on the countersignature line, in the neat professional hand of someone accustomed to signing consequential documents, Isabel Crane. Reyes looked at it. He looked at it for long enough that Suresh, standing beside him, glanced at his face. She did not ask what he was thinking. She had been in the firm long enough to understand when a silence contained information. Isabel arrived at 8:10. She entered the engineering bay with the composure of someone who had prepared for a difficult conversation: the investors, the timeline, the press inquiry that had come in at 6 a.m. from the Motorsport Publications reporter. She had her responses organized. She had a framework for managing the narrative. She looked at the telemetry board. She looked at Reyes. He handed her the archive file without speaking. She found her signature on the countersignature line in approximately 8 seconds. She held the file and said nothing for a moment. Beside her, the engine of the prototype ran with the even, balanced precision of a system restored to its original design, quiet and steady and completely indifferent to the conversation happening in front of it. She found him in the maintenance corridor at 9:40. Ethan was recalibrating a torque sensor on a production vehicle 3 bays down from the prototype, a routine task that occupied his hands without fully occupying his attention. He had been at the facility since 8:15. He had seen the senior engineers in the prototype bay through the window of the corridor, but had not gone in. He had completed 3 routine maintenance items on the morning roster, and had been on his way to the 4th when she found him. Isabel stood in the corridor with the archive file under her arm. She did not have staff with her. She had come alone, which Ethan registered as a decision, one she had made sometime between seeing her signature and deciding how to handle what came after. He set down the calibration tool and gave her his attention. "You accessed the prototype last night," she said. "I did. Without authorization from the engineering lead. I had authorization from the overnight supervisor. The maintenance access protocol." He said it without defensiveness. A statement of the procedural record, not an argument. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her working through something, not the facts, which she had already reviewed, but the arrangement of them, the way of approaching what needed to be said. "You were on the maintenance roster," she said. "For the past 6 years. 7, he said. "You designed the original system. Part of it. The torque balancing architecture. You never said?" He looked at her with the level attention he gave most things. "No." She opened the archive file and looked at the schematic. Her signature was on the simplification order 3 pages behind it, visible as the corner of the page where the file was opened. "Removing it was a decision made during a restructuring period," she said. "For timeline and cost reasons. The performance targets at that load range were met without it. At moderate load, yes," Ethan said. "The issue is sustained high-load operation. The distortion builds over cycles. It's not immediate, which is why it didn't surface in short-duration testing. The diagnostic team didn't identify the cause. They identified the symptoms," he said. "The cause is architectural. Replacing the rear chamber assembly wouldn't have corrected it because the assembly wasn't the problem. She looked at the schematic again. Then at him. What would you need? She said. To remain here. He understood she was not asking about compensation. She was asking about the conditions under which he could work with integrity inside the institution he was part of, which was a more honest question than she might have realized she was asking. Independent Engineering Review Authority, he said. For systems modification decisions above a defined threshold. Not advisory. Someone was standing to pause a change order and require full cycle testing. That changes the decision structure. It does, he said. That's what it's supposed to do. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the corridor window, the engineering bay was visible, Suresh at the telemetry board, Reyes reviewing the overnight documentation with a junior engineer. The prototype sat in its bay with the particular stillness of a machine at rest after a long time of operating incorrectly. The board convenes Thursday, Isabel said. I'll bring a governance proposal. All right, Ethan said. The proposal will reference your original design. That's accurate, he said. That's fine. She looked at him for a moment, the specific look of someone recalibrating the estimate they have been running on, finding it was built on the wrong inputs. He did not help her with this. Not unkindly. It was simply not his work to do. I owe you a public acknowledgement, she said. You owe the engineering record an accurate one, he said. That's the part that matters going forward. She nodded, once deliberate, the nod of a person who has heard something they will carry with them. Then she walked back toward the executive corridor. Ethan picked up the calibration tool and returned to the torque sensor. The press conference was held 10 days later. It was a different kind of event than the demonstration had been, smaller, more precise in its arrangements, with less ambient performance and more deliberate structure. The invited journalists included the motorsport publication reporter who had submitted the 6 a.m. inquiry the morning after the stall. The investors who had been present at the demonstration had been briefed privately the previous day. City officials were present because the Aurora project carried regional economic weight, and they had received questions they needed to be able to answer. Isabel stood at the front of the room with the prepared statement she had written herself, without the communications team's involvement, which Suresh and Reyes had both noted when she circulated it the night before. She opened with a direct account of what had happened at the demonstration, not framed as an unexpected environmental variable, not softened into the language of managed setback. She described a prototype failure that had been misdiagnosed by the engineering team, correctly identified by a maintenance staff member who recognized it as an architectural issue rather than a component failure, and resolved overnight by the same individual. She named him. Not as an afterthought, early in the statement, in the context of explaining the nature of the fix. Ethan Ward, our maintenance lead, is the original architect of the torque balancing geometry that was removed from the prototype platform during a 2017 cost reduction restructuring, she said. That removal created the conditions for the failure we witnessed. His restoration of the original design, completed in a single overnight session, produced engine performance that meets or exceeds the original design projection. She described the restructuring decision directly, including the decision-making chain. She acknowledged that the approval had come from her office. She did not use the language of external pressure or mitigating circumstance. She said the decision had been made on timeline and cost grounds. Invited journalists included the motorsport publication reporter who had submitted the 6 a.m. inquiry the morning after the stall. The investors who had been present at the demonstration had been briefed privately the previous day. City officials were present because the Aurora project carried regional economic weight, and they had received questions they needed to be able to answer. Isabel stood at the front of the room with the prepared statement she had written herself, without the communications team's involvement, which Suresh and Reyes had both noted when she circulated it the night before. She opened with a direct account of what had happened at the demonstration, not framed as an unexpected environmental variable, not softened into the language of managed setback. She described a prototype failure that had been misdiagnosed by the engineering team, correctly identified by a maintenance staff member who recognized it as an architectural issue rather than a component failure, and resolved overnight by the same individual. She named him. Not as an afterthought, early in the statement, in the context of explaining the nature of the fix. Ethan Ward, our maintenance lead, is the original architect of the torque balancing geometry that was removed from the prototype platform during a 2017 cost reduction restructuring, she said. That removal created the conditions for the failure we witnessed. His restoration of the original design, completed in a single overnight session, produced engine performance that meets or exceeds the original design projection. She described the restructuring decision directly, including the decision-making chain. She acknowledged that the approval had come from her office. She did not use the language of external pressure or mitigating circumstance. She said the decision had been made on timeline and cost grounds. After the prepared statements, a journalist asked Isabel whether the original engineer had been offered a return to a senior engineering role. She said a consulting engagement had been proposed. She said the specifics were between the company and Mr. Ward. In the back of the room, a junior engineer standing near Ethan, a recent hire who had joined 3 weeks before the demonstration and who was still calibrating the institutional landscape, leaned slightly in his direction. "Are you going to take it?" he asked quietly. Ethan looked at the front of the room, where the telemetry graphs were still displayed on the screen. The numbers were correct. The system was running as it had been designed to run. "We'll see," he said. The governance change took effect on the 1st of the following month. It was a structural reform rather than a symbolic one, which meant it had teeth where symbolic reforms have language. The independent engineering review requirement applied to all powertrain modifications above a defined threshold, modifications that affected core architecture, pressure routing, or load distribution. Any such change required a formal sign-off from a review panel that included at least one engineer with field experience in the relevant system category, and that panel had documented standing to pause, delay, or reject a modification order pending full long-cycle testing. The first review panel included Ethan. He had accepted the consulting engagement on the terms he had specified: independent authority for engineering review decisions, no reporting line to the marketing or commercial divisions, and a schedule that allowed him to remain available for Lily's school calendar. These were not negotiating positions. They were conditions, and they had been met because the governance reform had changed what was possible to offer. He spent 4 days a week at Crane. 3 of them were in the prototype bay and the engineering labs, working with Suresh's team on the production rollout of the restored torque balancing design across the full performance line. The 4th was in the review function, not reviewing continuously, but being available to review, which was the structural position the reform had created and which was, in its way, the more significant one. The junior engineers treated him with the specific deference that competence without ego produces in people who are paying attention. Not reverence. He wasn't interested in reverence, and they understood that. More like the careful attentiveness of people who have learned that there is someone in the room who knows something important, and is willing to share it, if you ask the right questions in the right register. He was not a demonstrative teacher. He showed things rather than described them. He worked beside people rather than above them. When he explained something, he explained it in terms of the underlying logic, what the system was trying to do, why the geometry served that purpose, what happened when the geometry was altered. He was building not just the correction but the understanding of the correction, which was the only way corrections persisted. Suresh told him, in the 3rd week, that 2 junior engineers had independently redesigned their section of the production rollout to incorporate principles from the original torque balancing documentation. Not because they were asked. Because they had read the documentation and understood it and applied it. He received this information with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has passed something along correctly. The corporate culture did not transform overnight. Cultures do not transform overnight. They shift in increments, under sustained pressure, when the examples of a different way of working accumulate to the point where the old way begins to look like what it was. The governance reform was one increment. The engineering first language that Isabel began using in public communications was another. The small, steady work of the prototype bay, producing systems that held that sustained load because they were built on correct geometry, that was the increment that compounded. Ethan watched it without trying to accelerate it. He worked on what was in front of him. He went home at a reasonable hour. He was present for dinner. He was home before sunset on a Thursday. This was notable only in the way that things are notable when they are different from the pattern. He had been home after dark most evenings for the better part of 7 years, and before dark arrivals had the quality of small gifts, both for him and for Lily, who was not accustomed to them but responded to them in ways she didn't fully articulate. She was at the kitchen table. She had a drawing in front of her, not the cloud project, which had been finished and graded and returned with a satisfactory mark. This was something new, produced in the particular way she produced things when she had a specific idea to execute, colored pencils arranged by the frequency she expected to need them, the drawing already substantially complete when he came through the door. He set his jacket on the hook. Keys in the bowl. "You're early," she said. "I finished the calibration run ahead of schedule." She looked up at him with the evaluating look. "Did the car work?" "The engine ran clean today," he said. "Full sustained load. The numbers were exactly where they were supposed to be." She nodded as if this confirmed something she had expected. Then she turned the drawing around so he could see it. It was a car. More technically specific than the last one. She had been asking questions about engines for several weeks in the small, sideways way she asked questions about things she was genuinely curious about, and the accumulated information had worked its way into the drawing. There were wheels with correct proportions. There was something rendered at the front that was recognizable as an engine bay. Inside it, she had drawn lines that were her interpretation of what he had described as channels. The balance lines, she had called them, the ones that kept the power even on both sides. "Does it look right?" she asked. He looked at it carefully. "The balance channels are in the right area," he said. "You've got the idea." She looked satisfied. "I'm going to put it with the important things." She meant the drawer. There was a drawer in the small bookshelf in the hallway, the second one down, the one she had decided, sometime in her 5th year of life, was for the things that deserved to be kept carefully. Report cards. A photograph of her mother. A letter he had written for her for the future and then changed his mind about, but she had found it first. The first tooth. A pressed leaf from the tree at her grandmother's house. She carried the drawing to the drawer with the care she reserved for that purpose. He followed her into the hallway and watched her place it in the drawer. She settled it with the precision of someone who knows that the way you place something is part of how you hold it. Then she looked up at him. "Was it like you thought it would be?" she asked. "Fixing it." He thought about this. About the 2:16 a.m. ignition, the numbers settling, the engine running in the quiet building in the specific way of a system that has been given back its correct geometry. About the statement in the record. About Suresh's engineers redesigning their sections on their own. "Yes," he said. "Mostly." She seemed to consider whether this was enough. She decided it was. "Good," she said, and went to the kitchen, where it was nearly time for dinner, and where the ordinary evening was waiting to be inhabited. He stood in the hallway for a moment, looked at the closed drawer. Then he went to start dinner, and the house moved around him with the particular quality of a place that holds, a structure in balance, carrying what it was built to carry.